Hi, Shawn. Thanks for joining me today. I'm so excited to have you on the channel. I look forward to what we have in store. So let's go ahead and dive right in. So this question I thought was perfect for you since you've been an athlete all your life. I wanted to basically help out a lot of the guys out there. There is often a fear that they'll lose muscle if they drop carbs, even when they have like extra body fat to lose. From your experience, how do you help men preserve or even build muscle while getting leaner on a carnivore diet?
Well, I mean, getting leaner and building muscle is always a challenge regardless of diet. I mean, that's always like the holy grail. I mean, if you've got a lot of excess body fat, then it's not hard. But once you start getting, when you're already relatively lean, it's challenging to put on muscle when you're already lean. But I mean, for the most part, muscle, I mean, building muscle, the primary mover for that is the training. I mean, that by far is more important than any dietary considerations. How you train, how consistently you train at the appropriate intensity or, with the appropriate volume and so on and so forth. So training is going to be the number one stimulus. If you're not training well, the diet doesn't really even matter, quite honestly. Then, beyond that, it's getting adequate protein. And I think protein, requirements, if you look at the traditional literature, it'll say somewhere around 1.6 grams per kilo is kind of what most people would quote. Although I honestly think low carb diets might push you a little bit higher, and particularly if you're, been training a long, long time and you've kind of already plateaued on the sort of beginner type gains that you might receive over the first 3 to 5 years, then you might even have to push that a little higher, 2 point, a lot of people will just say for sake of ease, 1 pound per pound, gram per pound of body weight, which is not unreasonable, I think, for a lot of people. And then it becomes, having adequate energy. And this is a real part where a lot of people will get into carbs are superior than fats. And, for some people that may be the case. It depends on, when I think about athletic performance, there's a whole gamut of things. It can be anything from like an Olympic lift, which, like a power clean takes, a second roughly to running a marathon. I mean, and everything in between. And so those all require, and they lean on different energy systems to different degrees. And I think for like the context of, say, putting on muscle, lifting weights, getting stronger, I think carbohydrates become, less essential from the energy standpoint. To say that, can you get enough calories through fat? Certainly you can. There are people that do that all the time. Some people prefer it that way. I certainly prefer it that way. I think that there is an adaptation period. If you've been, 30 years of your life, 20 years of your life used to consuming carbohydrates and the physiology that is associated with that, and you're well conditioned to doing that, it's going to take it's going to take some time to go away from that. Most of the data that's coming out now seems to indicate at least a month of transition. And I would argue for a lot of that, it's probably quite a bit longer, maybe more like 3 months for many people. I know for me, I didn't start breaking world records, and again, this is in rowing, which is a little bit different than bodybuilding, but I didn't start seeing those numbers until probably 6 months in. So, I think the primary thing is making sure you're training correctly. And then, I guess the problem is if you say, I don't have any energy, I can't train, that's an issue. It's going to impact your muscle growth. But if assuming you can figure out a way to get enough energy in, and one of the downsides of things like a low carb, ketogenic or carnivore diet are a lot of people, their appetite is suppressed. Because they're, or I should say, I turn it around. Carbohydrates for a lot of people drive appetite stimulation so that they can eat more. And when they can eat more, they have more energy. When they have more energy, they can train harder. So that's the thought. It's not that you can't do it other ways. And certainly self and many, many others have managed to do it, this way. Whether you want to give up carbohydrates or minimize them is up to you. I mean, there's certain people that have reasons for doing so, whether they're health reasons or preference reasons, or I will say, as someone that's, just about to turn 60 years of age as an athlete, I just feel better without carbs. I mean, my joints feel better, my tendons feel better. And when that happens, I can train harder. I mean, it's a simple metric of whether I hurt or not. And if I'm in pain and hurting, I just don't train as hard. It's just harder for me to do that. When my knees hurt, I don't feel like squatting. When my shoulder hurts, I don't want to do clean and jerks and stuff like that. So yeah, I mean, you can certainly do it. I mean, it takes some time. It takes a little bit of patience. It takes being a little bit deliberate about your nutrition. But at the end of the day, like I said, training is the most important stimulus for muscle growth if that's your main focus. So you got to do the training. Diet is way down the list secondarily to training.
I was going to ask also because you touched on like carbs. What do you think about the whole like, oh, you need carbs to have a pump? Like,
Well, I mean, the pump, if you think about it, it's fluid and it's basically water. I mean, you're getting blood flow, you're getting intracellular and interstitial fluid shifts. It's causing the pumps. Carbs facilitate that by the fact that they cause you to retain water. We know that. We know that carbs drive insulin higher. Insulin tends to cause the kidneys to retain more salt and water, and so we end up with a little bit more fluid available. If your goal is to chase a pump, you can certainly do that without the carbs. I mean, you just consume more fluid and electrolyte, and that's what I often do. And to be fair, your muscles contract harder and they function better when they're a little bit better hydrated. When we get relatively dehydrated, we lose performance, we lose strength, we lose muscle size, we lose muscle strength, and so you can certainly circumvent that by just prior to workouts consuming electrolyte and fluid, and so a lot of times I'll go and I'll drink a liter of, electrolyte enhanced water or something like that, before I go in and train, and my muscles are full and pumped, and, I get a just as good of a pump as I had before. Again, my goal is not bodybuilding. I've never been a bodybuilder. I've never had a desire to do that. It's not, I put on muscle, but it's not to get on stage and, and there in a bikini and squeeze my muscles. But yeah, I mean, you can certainly get a pump without carbs. Again, it's not the carbohydrate per se; it's the fluid that accompanies that, and you can manage your fluid, several ways.
I just wanted to ask those 2 questions because I get that a lot, and since I'm a girl,
Yeah.
I feel like my opinion's a lot less, validated by other men, and so I wanted to kind of touch on that with you, kind of clear
Yeah.
the air there. Moving on to a couple more juicier questions. This one's a bit of a challenge for just most people and understanding it, and I don't know if you can bring some clarity, but basically, you can't really speak to every situation on it, but I sometimes get the question asked if carnivore can fix type 1 diabetes. Can you clarify what carnivore can and cannot do? In that context, is it possible to come off of insulin? And in what cases or instances have you seen?
Yeah. So yeah, type 1 diabetes is, obviously a little bit different than type 2 diabetes. Type 2 diabetes is usually insulin resistant is a primary, I guess, problem here. And then when type 1 diabetes is, there's effectively no insulin being produced, which is different than being insulin resistant and having lots of insulin. So there's fundamentally different mechanisms there. And so for the most part, as of today, I mean, I know there's research still pending. Type 1 diabetes is not curable. I will say that I have seen people with type 1 diabetes go carnivore and come off insulin for some periods of time. Some people for long periods of time. Often that's in association with maybe the so-called honeymoon phase where there's still a little bit of beta cell function and the beta cells haven't been sufficiently, dedifferentiated or suppressed or damaged to the point where they can't mount, a response to lower blood glucose. This is something that and it's not, this isn't, pure speculation. There are a number of different subtypes of type 1 diabetes out there. There's different thoughts on what the etiology is, whether it's a viral induced phenomenon, whether it's an purely autoimmune phenomenon or some other, issue that's caused that. So the causes of type 1 diabetes might be amenable to different treatment options. Certainly at the very least, and I will say this with good confidence, that people with type 1 diabetes often have a much improved control of their diabetes, whereas they need much less insulin. They sometimes, have just a minimal amount. Maybe they require just a little bit of basal insulin and that's it, for some. They're also, and I think this is a real important because some people say, well, you're just masking the symptoms. What I have seen repeatedly with both type 1 and type 2 diabetics is that by going carnivore and fixing, whatever underlying issues that go with that, we often see the reversal of a lot of the problems with type 1 diabetes, such as retinopathy, where the vessels in their eyes are starting to become damaged. We've seen a reversal of kidney failure. We've seen a reversal of things like peripheral neuropathy and gastroparesis. All these things that we associate with longstanding type 1 diabetes or hypoglycemia can improve and do improve on a carnivore diet. Again, I'm not going to say for every single person. It happens enough to where it's worth more. It's worth investigating and trying. So if I was a type 1 diabetic or had a child who was a type 1 diabetic, I would strongly consider either at the very least a low carb diet and then maybe a full carnivore diet. Like I said, there are a couple of cases in the literature. There was a scientific paper put out about, I don't know, 5-6 years ago out of France, another around the same thing out of Hungary, where they looked at type 1 diabetics and they put them on a carnivore diet and they maintained that they have a reversal of that condition. Again, this is a one-off thing. It doesn't happen, routinely, but for some people it might be beneficial. I mean, it's certainly beneficial for any type of diabetic to consider a low carb approach. I mean, I think that is not even controversial at this point. I would hope for most people would understand that.
Yeah, that's very helpful. I appreciate you going into depth on that. Okay, so this is a big one. There's been a long-running narrative online that carnivore can cause insulin resistance, and specifically that you may even be pre-diabetic or metabolically unhealthy. Are these rumors like true at all? Could you explain, please?
Well, I mean, I think when we look at the etiology of type 2 diabetes, insulin resistance, and so on and so forth, a lot of the thought around that has to do with, too much fat will lead to insulin resistance, which will then lead to the symptomatic, what we call diabetes, type 2 diabetes. And there's some truth to that, in that, if you start to develop fat deposits within your cells, particularly ceramides, which are derived from palmitic acid, which is a saturated fat, you do see that. And there's also, this sort of physiologic, what we call glucose sparing. There's these adaptations that occur when you are not, consuming carbohydrates, because what happens is your body will preferentially save that glucose for your brain, for your red blood cells, the lens of your eye, and a few other tissues. And so certain tissues become relatively insulin resistant. I think that does occur. Is that aspect pathological? Some people would say that no, that's normal physiologic adaptation. What they'll say is that, so let me put it this way. If you eat a whatever diet, a carnivore, keto, vegan, vegetarian, Mediterranean, whatever, and you get fat and you start storing fat, yes, you will become pre-diabetic and diabetic with that. I think that's not unreasonable to make that statement. Now, however, most people, when they go carnivore, particularly if they're overweight or obese, they tend to lose weight. They tend to lose fat. They tend to restore. Like we see a lot of people, even on a high-fat diet, will reverse fatty liver disease, which is kind of runs similarly to, or visceral fat, which is similar. And we'll tend to reverse that situation. So it's not true to say that a carnivore diet is going to make you pre-diabetic or diabetic just by itself. Now, if you overconsume food and you get fat and you store visceral fat and you get, ceramide accumulation in your cells, then yes, it could do that. But it's not, but any diet can do that. I mean, I think that's the fairest way to look at this. For most people, as we mentioned, low-carb diets, ketogenic diets, carnivore diets tend to reverse that process. But I mean, it's not a black and white answer. It's kind of like, as much as I talk about eating, ribeye steaks and fatty meat, you can overconsume that stuff. I mean, I certainly can and have in the past, but at the same time, it's way harder for me to do that than it would be on a diet that includes, carbohydrates, particularly refined carbohydrates. If I start including refined carbohydrates in my diet, I'll put on weight like nothing. I mean, it's like within instance, I could put on 20 pounds, probably inside of a month if I consumed, all those things that people like to eat: pancakes and donuts and cakes and cookies and sweets and, things like that. That would be a very quick route for me to get sick.
That makes sense. You kind of touched on fatty liver, and I do have another question on that.
Mhm.
So I have two different situations. People who were told they have like fatty liver or they need to get their gallbladder removed. They either choose to get it removed or don't get it removed. Both situations, is carnivore safe for either of those options?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, with caveats. I mean, I think, if you like don't have a gallbladder, you certainly can do a higher fat diet, a keto diet, a carnivore diet. I mean, we've got thousands and thousands of examples of that. Initially, you might have to modulate how much fat you're consuming in a meal. You might have to break up the fat throughout the day, depending on, how much fat you feel like you need to consume. Our body will adapt to not having a gallbladder. We still produce bile. The liver is still making bile. It just doesn't store it temporarily in the gallbladder. It's now basically being stored in that common bile duct where, it waits for the valve to open so that, bile can flow into the small intestine when fat is stimulating it. As far as somebody who has, a need for a gallbladder to come out, so they have, cholecystitis of some sort. It depends on the severity, the acuteness, whether it's infected or not. I mean, if it's infected, it's hard to make the argument not to take it out. If it's, like gallstones or sludge or gallstones, or they've got, intermittent symptomatic cholecystitis, then you might make the argument that if you can fix the overall metabolic picture, then you might be able to salvage that situation with any number of diets, quite honestly. I mean, one of the problems, if you think about why we have a gallbladder in the first place, it's like, and it kind of points to the fact that we have fat in our diet. The gallbladder is there to store bile, which is something that's used to emulsify fats. And so when we, the way that normal physiology works, you eat some fat, we release a hormone called cholecystokinin, or CCK. That CCK tells the gallbladder to squeeze, and all the bile is squeezed out of it. And then it also causes something called the sphincter of Oddi to open up. And then that bile will just flow into the small intestine, and it'll mix with the fats we've just consumed. It'll start to break it into small particles. And then the various enzymes, lipases, will act on that to help break it up further so we can absorb it. So, we're supposed to eat fat. So when we go on this, when we eat a very low-fat diet for a long period of time, well, what happens is that bile just sits in the gallbladder, and it never contracts because there's no stimulus there, because it's always low fat, low fat, low fat. So that bile just sits there, sits there, sits there, and eventually cholesterol and the cholesterol salts start to precipitate out. You get sludge, and eventually it turns into stones, and then you become symptomatic, and then you start passing gallstones, and sometimes they get stuck, and it can cause all kinds of issues. Mostly it just causes pain for most people. Yeah, whether like I said, if you have your gallbladder out, I've seen many, many thousands of people do low carb diets, carnivore diets, no problem. Some people, if they're acutely symptomatic, you got to get a little more information on what the right thing to do is there. But I don't think it precludes carnivore in any stretch. You might have to, again, modify the fat because, like when you have an inflamed, irritated gallbladder, every time it squeezes, it hurts, right? It's just like, well, every time it squeezes, it hurts. And so can you get away with maybe doing a very small amount of fat at a time so it doesn't cause that that reaction while you're trying to lose weight, improve your metabolic health. It just may take a little bit of balancing to get through it.
Before we get any further, let's talk about the sponsor of today's video, Salter. You guys already know I'm extremely picky about what I put into my body, so I wouldn't recommend something that I don't personally use and enjoy myself. These are actually the only electrolytes I drink. I personally love the unflavored version, and one thing I especially love about these electrolytes is that they are made with high quality Norwegian sea salt, not your typical cheap table salt. Salter's products have also been tested for heavy metals and mold, and both came back undetectable. And that's huge for me because the deeper I get into my health journey, the more I realize the quality of what you're consuming really matters. Electrolytes are something I use regularly, whether it's first thing in the morning or throughout the day when I'm focusing on staying hydrated. So knowing that I'm using something clean and simple is really important to me. So if you want to try a really clean electrolyte product for yourself, I'll put a link down in the description so you can check it out. So like a low-fat diet is not good for your gallbladders?
Well, I mean, a low-fat diet is probably one of the etiologies of gallbladder disease, for the reason I mentioned, because the gallbladder never has a stimulus to contract. And so it's just like all this bile just builds up, and stays there and is static, doesn't move. And so when you have this, this mixture of, like if you were to take salt and you pour it into a glass of water, a lot of salt, and you mix it up, and the salt is, in the solution, and then you let it sit there for a couple of days, all the salt's going to fall out of the bottom, and then it's just going to build up. And so I think that's what's happening in the gallbladder in these people that are on these chronic low-fat diets.
That makes a lot of sense. It's crazy to think that just being in the realm of trying to be skinny or healthy, and then you go and you eat low fat and how much it can hurt your organs or just the way your body moves.
Yeah, I mean, there's a threshold for fat that if you get below, you start to run into problems. Some people say 20% of your calories coming from less than 20% of your calories coming from fat. You start to develop a whole bunch of issues, for a lot of people. And I think that holds up for a lot of folks.
Yeah. Well, I've heard the term lipotoxicity thrown around, the idea that fat can build up in the organs and cause problems, kind of like we're saying. Is there something people need to worry about on a carnivore diet with lipotoxicity?
Well, I mean, lipotoxicity is real. I mean, just like glucotoxicity is. I mean, this is what leads to a lot of issues. And so we talk about, for instance, there's this condition called de novo lipogenesis, where new fats are made in the liver using precursors, and that can come from ingested fats. It can come from carbohydrate. Your liver rearranges things chemically, and it creates these new fats. In fact, the palmitic acid I mentioned, which was, relatively toxic in the human body, is produced by the liver primarily. It's interesting. Several studies done by Jeff Volek and others have shown that, higher dietary saturated fat doesn't necessarily correlate with blood saturated fat, so because the liver has first kind of, rearranges everything. Yeah, I mean, again, this often comes down to how much, and I know a lot of people in the low carb space hate talking about calories and think calories are irrelevant and you can eat as much as you want and never gain fat. And this doesn't work for everybody. I can tell you, I've been around this long enough to know that there are definitely people that can overeat any kind of food, and get fat and have the consequences of that. So yeah, lipotoxicity is real. It's an issue. Again, at the end of the day, you still have to pay attention to how much you eat. The nice thing about, for me, at least for me, for carnivore, is it makes it easy. I mean, I have a hard time over consuming food when it's whole, natural, nutrient dense, satiating type foods. It's not impossible. I certainly can do it, but I mean, I got to work at it a little bit, and I'm naturally a person that eats a lot of food. I've always been a big appetite guy. I walked around at close to 300 pounds for 20 years. Eating a lot, lifting a lot, being very strong, but I had a huge appetite, and I still do. And so I still have to kind of just be mindful about what I eat. And I think most people would benefit from that. You just have to sort of kind of reframe, your definition of what it means to be satiated and what it feels like and how to put that in perspective. Some people that system is broken. The only time they feel full is when they are uncomfortably full. That's it. Like they feel like they've swallowed a goat, like a snake that swallowed a goat. That's the only time they feel full. So they constantly feel that is what they have to do to reach satiety. And I don't care what diet you're on. If you pursue that um, sort of you pursue that to its end, you're still going to have problems. I mean, there's people that like I see this all the time. There's all kinds of these, particularly these big guys that are 500-600 pounds. They go carnivore and they'll drop 100, 200, 300 pounds. But then they sort of stagnate there. It's still 100 pounds overweight or something like
Mhm.
that. And I think that's where they have to start realizing that there's a point where you have to pay attention, restrict things a little bit, do some exercise. I think those things are, dial in your sleep. The light circadian biology has a role here. Stress has a role, but I mean, like I said, it's easy for a while for a lot of people, particularly if they're significantly overweight. But then, if you want to get down to like, aesthetically lean, where you've got veins sticking out and ripped abs, you're going to have to, basically count calories and restrict some level of energy, whether it's carbs or fat, and train appropriately. That's just the reality.
So, is there like a root cause for some of those people who do go in carnivore, who do have success, but they just don't get to the last step, the last amount of weight? Like, is there a reason why they have this insatiable hunger still?
Well, I mean, again, when you say insatiable, I mean, it may be that, you know, they're trying to, go too quickly. Like I said, I'm not a bodybuilder. I've never been, never had a desire to do that. But I know that people that have generally long-term success and can do this sustainably, they are just slightly bringing the amount of food down. They're in a slight deficit, so to speak, or eating a little bit less than they used to. When a lot of people, they're trying to lose those last, 5, 10 pounds. They sometimes kind of overdo it. They say, well, I'm going to drop 500 calories out of my diet, 800 calories out of my diet. And then they're hungry. And then and then it backfires on them because, there's a point where it's a defense mechanism. If you get too hungry and you have access to food, which we all do, I mean, at least living in Western society, there's always food available. You get to a point where your body will say, I'm not going to experience that hunger again. Therefore, I'm going to overconsume to raise my body fat levels to a point where it's not an issue anymore. So you have to kind of be able to walk that line where you're just and I think you have to write it down. I think you have to, again, this doesn't apply to everybody. This applies to people that are wanting to really get lean. I think for a lot of people that are just trying to get normal body weight, they can just eat whole nourishing foods and listen to their appetite. But I think for those people that are like, hey, I really want to lose those last 5 pounds, then I think, you're often committed to, these other extra steps. Some people resort to drugs. I don't encourage that. I mean, I don't think that's a good I don't think that's a good way to do it, quite honestly, but a lot of people would disagree. And drugs are becoming so ubiquitous. You have 20-year-olds taking testosterone and everybody's taking, wanting to take these various, weight loss drugs to lose 5 pounds. I just think that's short-sighted and for a lot of people will backfire.
One thing I do want to touch on with you, what are your thoughts on like raw carnivore versus cooked carnivore? Because I get this question a lot in like my comments, and I just would love to know your perspective on it.
Yeah, I mean, I get a lot of people commenting to me, "Hey, you need to try raw carnivore." I tried that years ago. I didn't like it at all. I didn't enjoy the food. I enjoyed it 0%. I mean, sitting down to a cold hunk of meat was just not anything that appealed to me. I mean, yes, I'd lose weight doing that because I didn't like the food. I mean, so it's not sustainable for me personally. There is an increased risk for infection. I've known a number of people over the years that have done raw and have paid for it, with severe gastrointestinal infections, which took them years to recover from. I don't think it's necessary. I mean, I think if you think that, raw is so much better than cooked, the compromise is just, sear the outside of your meat and eat the inside, rare or raw. And I think that's probably a good compromise there. I mean, I'll go to a restaurant and eat beef carpaccio. I don't really enjoy steak tartare because they often throw a bunch of onions and crap in there, which I don't like anyway. And so I rarely get it that way. Obviously I've had sushi and stuff like that. I mean, there's people that are concerned about parasites and stuff like that. I don't generally worry about too much about that, particularly like in the US or well, not, I wouldn't say all countries, but most Western countries where they have fairly decent hygiene standards. I don't think it's that big of an issue, particularly if and particularly if you're healthy and you've got robust stomach acid. I don't think it becomes that big of a deal. But yeah, I don't buy into the you're not eating raw, you're missing out on all this magic and stuff because I just haven't seen it. I mean, I've taken care of, through the years and now, through my company Rivero. I mean, we've taken care of thousands and thousands of people on a carnivore diet. The difference between people that eat raw versus cooked versus grain finished versus grass finished is negligible. There's no real significant difference when it comes to a population level. I mean, there might be individuals who'll say, I felt raw was magical for me. And I guarantee I can tell you people that'll show that raw was a disaster for them. So, I mean, it's not, one or the other's not significantly better than the others. I mean, I'm not going to tell somebody not to do a raw carnivore diet. Just, just be cautious about where it's sourced because you can run into issues there. And when, in the off chance that it does occur, it can be a real nightmare and it can mess your health up for a long period of time. So just be cautious about it. But, this way, it might be a better option just because the food is not palatable. And I think that's, maybe it's the way to go for some people because you just don't like it. I think I could go on there's a lot of diets where I don't like the food where I'd lose weight. If you put me on an all vegetable diet, I hate most vegetables. I'd lose weight because I was like, I don't eat this crap. It doesn't taste good.
I agree. I couldn't do the whole raw diet thing either. Like, I've done, like you said, carpaccio and those things, but I would not thrive on not cooking my meat. I just love the texture of a good cooked steak.
We've been cooking meat for a long time. I mean, humans discovered fire and, been making use of it. Arguably, I mean, I think, the earliest estimates are something like, 1.6 million years we've been cooking, um, yeah, we did it for a reason, and we're adapted to it. I think we're pretty well adapted to it.
I'll take the fire. So, a bit of a switch. Michaela Peterson recently shared that she's been able to successfully include some foods outside of strict carnivore. What's your take when you see people reaching to that point or making statements like that, expanding their diets from long-term carnivores?
I don't. It's fine. I mean, whatever's working for people. I don't really care. I'm not married to it dogmatically. I'm a physician. I like getting people healthy. And health doesn't mean you must do whatever diet for the rest of your life. It's you get to a state of health and then you maintain that. And if that allows you, if you get healthy enough to where you can reincorporate some other foods and it makes you feel better and you enjoy it, good for you. I mean, that's more sustainable. I mean, I don't think anyone relishes the fact that they can only eat one type of food for the rest of their life. I mean, I don't think anyone's celebrating that. And so good for her, good for anybody else that manages to achieve that. Some people, I, for the most part, just kind of stick to carnivore for the most, every once in a while I'll have a food off the plan. But I mean, for the most part, partly because I certainly enjoy it. It's easy for me. I like the way I feel better with it. I could certainly occasionally add something to my diet without any significant ill effects. And I've done that occasionally, but I don't really care one way or the other. It doesn't diminish the effectiveness of a carnivore diet for someone who's sick. And this is where, like I said, as a physician, I look at it as a therapeutic option. Whether you do it for 3 months, 6 months, a year, 10 years, it doesn't really matter. If it's helpful to you, then by all means, you should try it. And I mean, we should celebrate those people that are getting healthy, regardless. I mean, I don't care if somebody does a vegan diet and they get healthy. That's fine by me. I mean, the problem I have with the veganism is all the ethical preachiness, moral superiority. You must do it. Meat is bad stuff. I mean, I think that's complete nonsense. But if you take people that are sick and getting them healthier, that's good for not only them, but it's also good for society. The less sick people we have, either physically or mentally, the better place the world is, right? And so, I mean, instead of just clinging to some belief system that vegetables are poison or vegetables trying to kill you, I don't think that's helpful. I think you can say, hey, for some individuals, these are not the right thing to eat, at least now or maybe long term, and then go from there. I think that's the better approach. And that's what even though I get lumped in with this sort of cultish, dramatic thing, I'm not really that way at all. I mean, our patients at Rivero, many of them go carnivore. Many of them need to go strict carnivore. But, if they are able to transition from that, we're happy for them. We're not like, you hurt our feelings because you didn't say carnivore. It doesn't really matter. Yeah, good for Michaela. Hopefully she's doing well. I haven't seen her in a few years. I guess I'll see her maybe this year at the meat stock thing in Tennessee. And we'll see how things are going. But yeah, I mean, if you can just get healthier, that's great. And the other thing is, I mean, diet is not the only thing you need to do here. I mean, I will talk about sleep. I'll talk about exercise. I mean, I'm a huge proponent of exercise. I think everybody should be exercising, regardless whether you like it or not. I know some
I
people
agree.
disagree with that, but like I said, carnivore is a tool, and for some people, it's a lifestyle. But I tend to look at it as a physician, as a therapeutic option for a lot of people. And whatever keeps people healthy, I'm happy to see.
Yeah, I love the answer. Like, I teach that to the people who, like, I have clients and they'll come to me wanting to do Lion's diet and then they realize that they're not thriving and blah, blah, blah. And so then we have to make a switch. I'm like, I'm okay with you, adding in some other foods. Like, if this is where you're going to stick with a plan to lose weight, to get, your autoimmune issues in remission, like all these things, like I am for that. So loved that answer. Switching to a little bit of like your plyometric style, little backstory. My husband and I really love to do like training plyometrics. I think it's so beneficial, but I admire that you do it. And so I'm just kind of curious, as you've aged, why do you continue to push yourself with plyometrics and intense training and jumping and sprinting and all those things? We're often told as we get older to slow down and to be careful and all these things. Is it something that us as a society are missing with aging and like physical performance? Or are you just this wild exception that's just crazy athletic even as you age?
No, I mean, well, I might be a little bit exceptional, but it's not because there's something special about me. It's because um, care to do so. I mean, when we look, I'm an orthopedic surgeon, right? I know a lot about joints and musculoskeletal health. I mean, I spent most of my life studying that stuff. I mean, like for instance, the cartilage in our joints, our knee, hips, ankles, whatever it be, they need to see stress. I mean, they need to be stressed in order to distribute nutrients. I mean, there's not a good blood supply, so that actual cyclic nature of stressing and de-stressing the joints, like when we walk, as an example, is necessary to maintain the health of those cells and those tissues. Um, just like our muscles respond to stress, if we don't ever exercise our muscles, what do? They atrophy. You stick your arm in a cast for, for 3 months and you pull it out and the arm's like a little withered stick. So, I mean, the cartilage, the tendons, they all have the same sort of reaction to stimulus. Yes, nutrition is incredibly important. In fact, I'm giving a lecture on this next month at this COSI event. I'm going to be talking about this stuff. But I think it's harmful to tell a person just because they're older and getting older that they should slow down and they should not do athletic things like jump and sprint and hop and skip and bound and lift heavy weights and stuff like that. I think that's actually directly counterproductive. Now, if someone's already injured and they've got compromised tissue, that's a little more nuanced discussion. But for a person who has got reasonably healthy joints, I think continuing to nourish them the correct way with the proper nutrition, to continue, recovery with sleep, but continue to stimulate them is important. And for me, because I have the requisite strength, I spent almost 50 years lifting weights, my joints and my muscles and my tendons can handle those activities. So I continue to do those in effort, because if I'm 80 years old and hopping around, and jumping and running sprints, it isn't going to be because I didn't do it in my 50s and 60s. It's because I continue doing it in my 50s and 60s and 70s. And I mean, I think we're getting to a point where we're starting to see, this is interesting because, up until recently, like for instance, going to the gym, working out, lifting weights, that type of stuff, before like really the 1980s, no one really did that. I mean, in the 70s, bodybuilding was starting to take hold. There were initially some people doing that. They started to popularize it, but the mass of the population, and to be honest, today, most of the population still doesn't exercise with any regularity, but we're just now starting to see people that started exercising as adults and maintain that for 40, 50 years, reaching their 70s and 80s right now. And you got some people that are in incredible shape in their 70s, and they're very functional. They're out there running sprints and jumping and doing gymnastics. And that's because they maintain it their whole life and they continue to do that. And so to tell someone that, hey, you're getting 40, it's time to slow down and start to, just train with less intensity, I think is wrong. I think intensity is important. I think the volume you have to monitor, and that goes for a young athlete too. It doesn't really change that much whether you're young or old. I mean, you as a young athlete, you can damage yourself by overemphasizing intensity plus too much volume. I think that's a problem. So you have to be judicious about where you put that intensity, but you still need it irrespective of your age. And like you say, like I'll put up a workout where I'll do some sprints and I might just run 2 sprints. I mean, that's it. That's the whole workout. I mean, as far as that's concerned, I'm not out there doing like, 20, 100-meter sprints. I'm doing like 2 and that's it, because that's all the volume I need at that high level of intensity that I can continue to maintain capacity. Because, like you look at the typical old person, what happens to an old person? They get fat, they get weak, they get slow, right? And so that is a classic hallmark of aging. you know? And when I mean fat, I don't necessarily mean they can become rotund, but they lose muscle mass and they replace it with fat. They may be skinny, but they're still relatively fat, on a per kilogram basis. And so doing those things that prevent that are effectively going to delay aging, in my view. It's more important than sort of worrying about your mitochondria or there's some obscure blood marker, which a lot of people get obsessed with, and they, taking supplements for this. If you're still fat, weak, and slow, I don't care what you're doing. You've got to address that issue. And the only way to do that is to eat right, sleep well, and exercise, for the most part. So that's why I emphasize so much for myself, and hopefully other people will catch on to this and maybe do the same for themselves because, life's a lot more fun when you can do stuff, right? I mean, it's great to, work for 40 or 50 years, retire when you're 65 or 70, and then all you can do is walk.
Yeah.
All I can do is walk. It always cracks me up when I get people that tell me, oh, well, all the 100-year-old people that I've ever seen, they just walk around and garden, right? That's what they do. And that must be the key to longevity because this is what old people do. I said, that's because that's all they can do, right? That's all they're able to do. I mean, I can stick you in a nursing home and I can show you a bunch of 100-year-olds that are sitting there staring at the wall with a urine-soaked diaper. Is that the key to longevity? I mean, it's just like, no. I mean, we know that unequivocally that strength and particularly power, and there's a new study showing that power capacity is one of the best predictors of longevity when it comes to that form. So what does power mean? The ability to move weight rapidly. So like jumping. How far can I jump? If I can jump real far, I can produce a lot of power. So people that preserve those capacities, in my view, are going to at least have a better quality of life. They're going to have greater amount of function, whether it translates into a few extra years, I don't know. I mean, I don't think anybody really knows, but I mean, at the very least, gosh, you should seek out having a good quality of life. And that involves doing the things that young people do. Young kids can run and jump and play and swing from the monkey bars and jump. You get a 60-year-old and tell them to jump down off of a 2-foot curb and they're like, oh my God, I don't know, I might break my Achilles might snap, right? And it might because they haven't done anything. They haven't done anything in 40 years, and so these people get injured from trivial stuff, like stepping off a curb. They twist and roll their ankle, break their ankle from a fall, minor trip or stumble. So by maintaining the capacity to jump and skip and hop and change directions and cut and sprint and decelerate and accelerate and being strong absolutely is incredibly important. I don't care what your age is.
That's awesome. Yeah. I hope to continue to jump around and be the silly ones in the gym still jumping. So,
obviously you want to do it to a point where you don't get injured. So you want to make sure you have the capacity to do what you do. I mean, I didn't start out doing, 48-inch box jumps at 59. I mean, I was doing lower and building up, and then, developing the strength to do that, and then having the strength to weight ratio and having the lots of, extensive plyometrics, deep tier plyometrics where I'm just doing the things to build that tissue capacity so that I could handle those higher intense loads. Because yes, you can get hurt. I mean, people say, oh, you're going to get hurt. You're going to hurt your knees. And I said, well, I could, but I spent the time building the base and putting in the work so that I can do these things. And if I never do those things, then I lose that. My ceiling gets lower and lower and lower. And you want to keep that nice high ceiling so you have this, the ability to have a robust capacity for what you can do. Same thing with your brain. When you can't even think anymore. You can barely remember where you left your car keys. You lose capacity there too.
Yeah, that's so important. I often think about that. I'm like, I need to stay reading. I need to stay stimulating my brain, post school and stuff, very important.
Well, I mean, we got a lot of people just going to use AI for everything. I don't even think anymore. Just tell me AI, tell me what to do.
Yeah. Tell me what this book was about.
Mhm.
Okay, this last question is kind of a selfish one that is applying to just me and my life in the near future. So basically, what are your thoughts on pregnant women, young children, or whole families eating a carnivore diet? Are there any nutrients that they might be missing, and how would you address those gaps, if any?
Well, certainly I've seen, I don't know how many, hundreds of women that have done carnivore pregnancies now, and they've done fine, and they've had healthy babies, and they've nursed the babies fine on carnivore, and a lot of little kids they fed carnivore. They've all done fine that I've seen. I mean, in theory, people would be concerned about things like folate. Low folate is associated with neural tube defects. So think kids that could have like spina bifida and some of those issues. And so if I were a woman considering a carnivore pregnancy, there's two things I would consider. One, I probably wouldn't start it in the middle of pregnancy because there's a physiologic stress that goes that, and you probably don't need that shock to the system in the middle of your, second trimester, first trimester, or something like that. And the other thing is, I would just, and this is what they do anyway, they just give you prenatal vitamins. You've got the various vitamins they think are important there. And I think that's probably all you need to really worry about. I mean, the other thing you might want to worry about is, the oral glucose tolerance test they'll give you, for gestational diabetes. Because, if you're not consuming carbs, you probably fail that. If they tell you to slug, now go slug 75 grams of glucose,
Mm.
syrup, your blood glucose is going to go up and they're going to diagnose you as diabetic and then they're going to want to maybe put you on insulin or who knows what they'll do. So, I mean, I think, you have to inform your obstetrician that, hey, I'm on a whatever low carb keto carnivore diet, just so they know. So, and, a lot of them are cool with skipping out the oral glucose tolerance test. They'll just say, hey, let's just check your blood glucose a few times. Let's maybe work more CGM, probably it makes sense to take the prenatal vitamins. I mean, obviously, for centuries, millennia even, there have been women who have been on carnivore diets, that in populations that basically are more or less carnivore. You look at, Inuit, Maasai, or whatever population, and they've delivered plenty of babies and have done fine with that. But I mean, I think, it probably doesn't hurt to just, um, making sure you're getting all the nutrients that are thought to be there. And like I said, when it comes to pregnancy, I think probably the biggest one I would be concerned about would be folate, and it can be low. I mean, you can get it. You can eat liver, you can eat eggs, you can eat some other things to bump your folate levels up if you're really concerned about that. But I mean, that's really what I would say. I mean, I can tell you that I mean the women that have had carnivore pregnancies and subsequent lactation to feed their kids have commented they just produce milk like crazy. I mean, they've got so much milk, and it's probably likely of higher quality. I mean, there's actually studies on vegetarian and vegan breast milk showing that it tends to be lower in some of these critical essential fats, the DHA, EPA, and so on and so forth. And so, it's you know, I think in general it's a net positive for pregnancy and breastfeeding and so on and so forth.
That's amazing. That's really good to know. I feel like we don't speak enough about pregnancy, carnivore, or even like any type of low carb diet where it's focused on nutrient density. So thank you for touching on that. Basically, that is a wrap for all my questions for you today. I wanted to thank you for being here and I appreciate your knowledge and it was really fun to sit down and talk with you. So thank you so
Well,
much for
thank
that.
you for having me. I appreciate it.